Greetings, everyone. My name is Sheila Vance. Today, the United States Postal Service launched a stamp in honor of the great Phyllis Wheatley, the first African American woman to publish a book, hers being a book of poetry. I take this occasion to launch my new podcast titled What Would You Do for Democracy? The Evolution of the Revolution. This podcast, which replaces my Threshold to Valley Forge podcast, which is about my award winning book, Threshold to Valley Forge, The 6 Days of the Gulf Mills Encampment, which occurred December 12th to 19th, 1777. This podcast is the evolution of my previous podcast. My new podcast ties the people, places, and activities of the Gulf Mills Encampment directly to the question, what would you do for democracy? Which is a question that I asked myself as I felt the extreme personal sacrifice of the soldiers, officers, their families, and all citizens of the new United States when I wrote the book. I posted this question, because it's still there, this question prominently on my website, and I asked attendees to think about this question as they listen to my presentation and speeches. The What Would You Do for Democracy podcast will start with a look into the people I talk about in my book. I will dive deep into their backgrounds and contributions. I will tie their lives and contributions to what is happening today. I will often have guests who will provide special insights into that person or situation as they talk about what they are doing for democracy today. And I will end every episode with the question, what will you do for democracy? So let's dive into today's episode. I have a special affinity for Phyllis Wheatley, and I consider her my shero. That's a hero, except it's a woman. So that's why we call her a shero. As a writer and book publisher myself with my company, the Elevator Group, I feel close to Wheatley on that basis alone. I know how hard it is to write and publish a book, especially as an African American woman, her being an enslaved one for part of her life, or about half of her life, actually. When I could not find a publisher for my book, my first book, the novel Chasing the 400, I published it myself. Then I went on to publish 15 other books and 8 other authors. I also wrote another 5 books besides Threshold to Valley Forge. Wheatley inspired me. Also, I was a journalism major at Howard University School of Communications. So again, I was drawn to Wheatley's accomplishments and courage as a writer. I first learned about Wheatley during my freshman year at Howard when I lived in Wheatley Hall, named after her. What a legacy that was impressed on my mind as soon as I started college. And as someone who has written extensively about the Revolutionary War since 2011, I feel close to Wheatley's writings about the same. She lived during that time period. She wrote poems for General George Washington, and she even corresponded with and met him and other founders. She took a stand for liberty and for the commander-in-chief, in spite of, or because she knew what it was like to be enslaved as she was. She knew what it was like to not be free. Like many former enslaved persons, she hoped that other enslaved persons would too be free. I start my book with a quote from Wheatley's October 26, 1775 letter to Washington. That quote is, "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading. Washington, be thine." So that poem she sent to Washington, but that poem is in full. I'll put the link in this podcast so you can see it, and maybe if I have time or feel like it, I'll read the whole poem at the end of this podcast. But let's do a deep dive now into the life of Phyllis Wheatley. George Washington's Mount Vernon does an excellent job of providing information about Wheatley, as well as an analysis of her poems in great detail. I have highlighted some of that information. So let's just start with the remarkable legacy of Phyllis Wheatley. exploring her impact, challenges, and connection to George Washington. The importance and history of Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley stands as one of the earliest published African American poets and a remarkable figure in American literary history. Born in West Africa around 1753, she was kidnapped and brought to Boston, Massachusetts aboard the slave ship the Phyllis at about age 7 or 8. Purchased by the Wheatley family in 1761, Phyllis was taught to read and write, which was a rare occurrence for an enslaved person in 18th century America. Her extraordinary aptitude for poetry became evident in her teenage years, and she soon began composing verses that would earn her international recognition. So Wheatley's accomplishments are especially significant given the social and historical context in which she lived. In an era when enslaved people were denied basic human rights and education, Wheatley's literary achievements challenged the prevailing beliefs about race and intellect. Wheatley was taken to London by the Wheatley family in early 1773. While there, Wheatley met with Ben Franklin. On July 7, 1773, Franklin wrote to a friend, Jonathan Williams, about Wheatley, quote, "Upon your recommendation, I went to see the Black poetess and offered her any services I could do her. Before I left the house, I understood her master was there and had sent her to me, but did not come into the room himself. And I was not pleased with the visit. I should perhaps have inquired first for him, but I had heard nothing of him, and I have heard nothing since of her," end quote. So Nathaniel and Susanna Wheatley took Phyllis in 1773. Upon her enslaver Susanna Wheatley's death in 1773, Wheatley was freed. Wheatley's first and only published book, called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was released in London in 1773 when she was about 20 years old. The collection includes 39 poems, primarily written in neoclassical style, reflecting themes of religion, morality, and freedom. Notable works from this collection include, quote, "On Being Brought to Africa from America," end quote, quote, "To the University of Cambridge in New England," end quote, and quote, "On the Death of the Reverend Mr. George Whitefield." This book made her the first African American and one of the first women in the United States to publish a book. And there is an original signed Phillis Wheatley book at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. I have a picture of that book on the blog post that accompanies this podcast. And I was very honored to hold a copy of that exact Phillis Wheatley book in my hands several years before the book actually was donated to the Museum of the American Revolution. So that was an absolute thrill for me as a Phillis Wheatley, I'm going to say worshiper. So, but that book is in the Museum of the American Revolution, and they are very proud to have it there. So, despite her talents, Phillis Wheatley faced intense skepticism from white society. Many white men doubted that an enslaved Black woman could produce poetry of such sophistication. To address these doubts, Wheatley was subjected to an examination in 1772 by a group of 18 prominent Boston men, including politicians, clergymen, and such scholars such as John Hancock, who questioned her about her work. This group concluded that Wheatley was indeed the author of her poems, and their signed attestation, was included as a preface to her book. This experience highlights the racial prejudices of the time and the extraordinary hurdles that Wheatley had to overcome simply to be recognized for her talent. And I'm going to say this as an African American woman who writes about the Revolutionary War. I feel some of the same things that Phillis Wheatley felt. I have had to overcome racial prejudice about my work on the Revolutionary War. There aren't a lot of African American authors who write about the Revolutionary War. I knew when I wrote this nonfiction book, full length, Threshold to Valley Forge, to 6 days of the Gulf Mills encampment, that as an African American woman and as someone who's not a PhD historian, I call myself a journalist historian, um, in the line of vein of someone who's a journalist who does research and writes books about nonfiction, I knew I had to come with the receipts. So my book has 400 footnotes, 10 pages of a bibliography. I knew I had to document the facts in my book, and they are there for anyone to look at. So I feel what Phyllis Wheatley felt. Luckily, my book has been accepted um, in the field, but I can tell you, not without some of those feelings and some of that blowback. So let's move on. Phyllis Wheatley and George Washington. Wheatley's influence extended to the leaders of her era, notably George Washington. In 1775, she wrote a poem titled To His Excellency George Washington, which praised his leadership during the American Revolution and presented him as a champion of liberty. In Wheatley's October 26, 1775 letter to Washington, she wrote, quote, I have taken the freedom to address your excellency in the enclosed poem, end quote. She continued, quote, though I am not insensible of its inaccuracies, your being appointed by the Grand Continental Congress to be generalissimo for the armies of North America, together with the fame of your virtues, excites sensation not easy to suppress, end quote. Washington tucked the letter away with a mound of other correspondence and documents. In February 10, 1776, Washington again came across Wheatley's letter under a pile of papers. At the end of a long letter to Colonel Joseph Reed of Pennsylvania, Washington wrote, quote, I recollect nothing else worth giving you the trouble of, unless you can be amused by reading a letter and poem addressed to me by Miss or Miss Phyllis Wheatley. In searching over a parcel of papers the other day, in order to destroy such as were useless, I brought it to light again. At first, with a view of doing justice to her great poetical genius, I had a mind to publish the poems, not knowing whether it might not be considered rather as a mark of my own vanity than as a compliment to her. I laid it aside till I came across it again in the manner just mentioned. So Washington wrote Wheatley on February 28th, 1776. His letter reads, to Phyllis Wheatley, Mrs. Phyllis, and he wrote it from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it starts, Mrs. Phyllis, your favor of the 26th of October did not reach my hands till the middle of December. Time enough, you will say, to have given an answer ere this. Granted, but a variety of important occurrences continually interposing to distract the mind and withdraw the attention, I hope will apologize for the delay and plead my excuse for the seeming but not real neglect. I thank you most sincerely for your polite notice of me in the elegant lines you enclosed, and however undeserving I may be of such encomium and panegyric, the style and manner exhibit a striking proof of your great poetical talents, in honor of which, and as a tribute justly due to you, I would have published the poem had I not been apprehensive that, while I only meant to give the world this new instance of your genius, I might have incurred the imputation of vanity. This and nothing else determined me not to give it place in the public. If you should in the public prints, I'm sorry. If you should ever come to Cambridge or near headquarters, I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the muses, and to whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensations. I am, with great respect, your obedient, humble servant, George Washington. So, impressed by her work, Washington invited Wheatley to visit him at his headquarters in Cambridge in March 1776. Their meeting at that time was a testament to Wheatley's growing reputation and the respect she garnered from some of the most influential figures in American history. Washington later expressed his gratitude in a letter acknowledging her poetic tribute. Colonel Reed, however, published Wheatley's poem in the Virginia Gazette on March 30, 1776. Mount Vernon records, quote, Reed published the poem in the Virginia Gazette on March 30, 1776, just a month after Thomas Paine's Common Sense ignited the spirit of colonial America. Paine, perhaps wishing to be inclusive to Wheatley's revolutionary rhetoric, republished the poem with Reed's headnote that emphasizes Wheatley's racial identity. Quote, the following letter and verses written by the famous Phillis Wheatley, the African poetess, and presented to His Excellency George Washington, end quote. Paine included the poem in the April 1776 edition of his Pennsylvania magazine. Wheatley wrote a second volume of poems, but sadly that was not published before her death in 1784 at age 31. She did marry. All of her children from her marriage to John Peters died in infancy, and she, unfortunately, died in poverty. So her enduring legacy. Phillis Wheatley's legacy is one of resilience, intellect, and artistic achievement. She broke through immense barriers to become a published poet, challenged the racist assumptions of her time, and influenced major figures, in early American history. Although she struggled to find a publisher for a second volume of poetry during her lifetime, many of her poems survived in newspapers and private letters. Today, she is celebrated not only as a literary pioneer, but also as a symbol of the power of education, the importance of voice, and the enduring struggle for equality. Her life and work continue to inspire readers, writers, and advocates for social justice across generations. So I started this. I'm sorry. There's my phone. I started this. Now, I have to decline on my computer. Anyway, I started this by saying that today the United States Postal Service is issuing a Phillis Wheatley stamp. And I ordered several sheets of the stamp. There are also notebooks with Phillis Wheatley's picture or a drawing of her. And I think it's an inspirational quote from her on the outside, and other little things that can be ordered that show Phillis Wheatley. I ordered them for myself, for my children, for my friends who I went to Howard University with, who also honor and revere Phillis Wheatley. So I hope you go to the United States Postal Service website and order some of those stamps, Phillis Wheatley stamps, and other paraphernalia today. And they're not paying me for saying that. I'm just saying that to you. So anyway, Phillis Wheatley's poem. I think I will read it. Maybe I'll cut it out before I post this podcast, but I'm going to read it to you because I want to give her that honor of her poem to George Washington. Here we go. Celestial choir enthroned in realms of light. And hold on, let me just say, it's written in the language of the time, not the language of today, the language of 1776, 3, 5, anyway, that time. So here we go. Celestial choir enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. While freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms, she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. See Mother Earth, her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light, involved in sorrows and the veil of night. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair. Olive and laurel brand binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise. Muse, bow propitious, while my pen relates how pour her armies through 1,000 gates. And when Aeolus heaven's fair face deforms, enwrapped in tempest and a night of storms, astonished ocean feels the wild uproar. The refluent surges beat the sounding shore. Or thick as leaves in autumn's golden rain, such and so many moves the warrior's train. In bright array they seek the work of war, where high unfurled the ensign waves in air. Shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou know'st them in the fields of fight. Thee, first in place and honors, We demand the grace and glory of thy martial band. Famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more, hear every tongue thy guardian and implore. 1 century scare performed its destined round when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon, Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising halls of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading. Washington be thine. So that's Phillis Wheatley's famous poem to General George Washington. So this is the first episode of my new podcast, What Would You Do for Democracy? I hope you'll tune into it wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, or whatever. So we're going to have an episode about once a week. And like I said, I'll be talking about characters in the book, and I'm essentially going to go through the book sequentially, diving deep into the really important and interesting personal stories of the people that I talk about in the book. And I'll be bringing in some of my fellow, what I would call Revolutionary War nerds, aficionados, historians, people who know and love history and this country, to get their insights and updates on their activities of what they're doing for democracy. So, as I said, I'm going to end every podcast with this question: what would you do for democracy? Thank you very much for tuning in. See you next week. Bye.